Hello and welcome to Mabinda TV. Hello and welcome to Mabinda TV. So for now, I like to look at the prospect of Kalonzo Musyoka. Of course, Kalonzo Musyoka is definitely going to be the united opposition candidate. So Kalonzo Musyoka is going to be the united opposition candidate. So basically, what prospect does who will he choose as his running mate? That is, who will Kalonzo Musyoka choose as his running mate? So basically, right now, you have Kalonzo Musyoka, you have Edwin Sifuna, you have Fred Matiang'i, you have Rigathi Gachagua. So basically, Kalonzo Musyoka is going to select among them. That is Edwin Sifuna, Fred Matiang'i, and Rigathi Gachagua. So basically, we start with Sifuna. Sifuna looks like he is the leader of the Gen Z. So of course, some will say that he should go all the way to the presidency. In the recent opinion poll by TIFA, Kalonzo Musyoka was the fourth. That is, Edwin Sifuna was the fourth at about 10%. So you had number one, you had President William Ruto at 24%, Kalonzo Musyoka at 19%, then you had Fred Matiang'i at 14%, and Edin Sifuna at 10%. So basically, and Rigathi Gachagua 9%. So basically, that is that ticket for you. So basically, what I'm asking is a Kalonzo Sifuna ticket viable? Basically, of course, according to the same poll by TIFA, Linda Mwananchi camp of ODM commands 74% of the support of ODM supporters, and then you have Linda Ground by Oburu Odinga at 26%. So basically, you have Edwin Sifuna saying he cannot be the Secretary General. You have Edwin Sifuna saying he cannot be the Secretary General to he cannot be the Secretary General to Oburu Odinga. So basically, I think right now then the running mate issue has to come into play. And of course, Fred Matiang'i came into the limelight as Uhuru's de facto prime minister. That is Fred Matiang'i. You remember very well during Uhuru's time, it was Fred Matiang'i that was running things. And then, of course, when Uhuru sometimes got to the bottle. It was Fred Matiang'i that was running things. Fred Matiang'i got to the limelight because of cracking down on exam cheating. And that is how Fred Matiang'i came to be known. He reduced the number of A's in 2016 from over thousands of A's to just 141 A's. In the previous year, some schools had 200 straight A's, and then Matiang'i reduced that to 141 A's. Basically, only that Matiang'i reduced the A's to only 141, and that is how then Fred Matiang'i came to be known as the Minister of Performance. Of course, after that, he was moved to the Interior Ministry. That is, Fred Matiang'i was moved to the Interior, more powerful Interior Ministry. Of course, you have the River Yala dumping of bodies, and of course, the River Yala dumping of bodies and the Ruaraka land saga following him through. But of course, you can't be sure. He is a technocrat. So Matiang'i is not more of a politician; he's more of a technocrat. And of course, some believe that he is the solution to Kenya's problems. Of course, you have a Kenyan leader is disjointed. The other peasants, so basically emotionally appeals to the citizenry, and so gets elected, but then they don't have the economic means to uplift their people from poverty, or maybe a leader could be a technocrat. So they have all the solutions to the country's problems. But then, of course, they don't have the emotional connection to the people, so they don't get elected. So I think for now, Kalonzo Musyoka will have to think twice whether Fred Matiang'i can bring in the votes. But I think Fred Matiang'i could be instead. Of course, he comes from Kisii, and of course, that's not a very majority. That's about 1 million votes. And I think that is where maybe Rigathi Gachagua could question him, asking can he get the support of Mount Kenya? Of course, Rigathi Gachagua could be a formidable running mate to Kalonzo Musyoka. Rigathi Gachagua has the Mount Kenya voting bloc that's about 10 majority Kikuyu counties. There are about 10 majority Kikuyu counties, and I think you have Rigathi Gachagua. Basically, he could come in as the person with the votes. There are about 8 million Mount Kenya votes. That's the mountain. Basically, in the last three presidential elections, the mountain has always chosen the correct presidential candidate ever since Mwai Kibaki, then Uhuru Kenyatta, and now William Ruto. In fact, William Ruto was going to lose it, but then, of course, you had Raila Odinga winning in 6 of the 8 provinces, but then William Ruto got a majority of the votes from Central Kenya. That is how he was able to beat out Raila Odinga. So basically, I think Rigathi Gachagua will be coming with the numbers and saying, "Look, I have the numbers, so I think I can dislodge." I can dislodge William Ruto from power. Of course, William Ruto is having a hard time in retaining the Mount Kenya voting bloc. Of course, now he has been abandoned by the last ally to abandon him, Irungu Kangata, the governor of Muranga County. Of course, Irungu Kangata said he will not defend his gubernatorial seat on a UDA ticket, of course, pointing out that he is going to defend his seat on a DCP ticket. Most likely, the DCP party of Rigathi Gachagua is growing very much in popularity. That is the DCP party, the Democracy for Citizens Party of Rigathi Gachagua. Look at how he did in Muruadike by election. Of course, it was won by UDS David Ketet by 18,000 votes, but the DCP candidate came close, I think, at 10,000 votes. So you can't be sure that the DCP party of Rigathi Gachagua is going by leaps and bounds, and I think that is the way. Then we could look at these parties. Of course, a day in politics is a lifetime. A day in politics is a lifetime, and of course, we could see this tribal arithmetic change. But remember, Kenyans vote along tribal lines. Kenyans vote along tribal lines, and I think that is the way then you could have the elections in 2027 reflecting that. So, of course, it is a foregone conclusion. Of course, it is not a foregone conclusion that Kalonzo Musyoka will be the running mate, will be the united opposition candidate. But I think things could change. We could see Kalonzo Musyoka emerging as the man to beat. Of course, Kalonzo is 72. He has been the running mate to Raila Odinga in two of the past three elections. He was the running mate to Raila Odinga in 2013 and 2017, and of course in 2022 he would have been, of course, but then Martha Karua was seconded by Uhuru Kenyatta. So of course you had Kalonzo Musyoka staying on, he would have been the prime cabinet secretary. So of course you have Kalonzo Musyoka saying it is his time, and he has even trademarked Kalonzo 2027. So Kalonzo Musyoka has trademarked that press that is Kalonzo 2027. That is now a trademark of Kalonzo Musyoka. So you can see very much, of course, President Ruto hits out at Kalonzo that basically Kalonzo Musyoka is not development minded, that the tarmac to his rural home, there is no tarmac to his rural home. So basically saying, for this man that has been in politics for over 40 years, how can he not have a tarmac to his home? But I think that's very distrustful. I think Kalonzo Musyoka maybe did not have the money, but of course, Kalonzo Musyoka is a social democrat. So social democrats are about sharing the cake equitably. So he will want more development to go to the people of Kambani and other marginalized regions of Kenya. So basically, that is the way it is. That is social democrats, and I think also Sifuna is a social democrat that is share the cake more equitably. I think a report by the Daily Nation showed that for every shilling that a poor person made, a rich person made 56 shillings. So basically, you can see how very much Kalonzo Musyoka wants to be a pro-poor politician. But I think what we need to be doing right now is analyzing these politicians. Will these politicians campaign on ideology? But I think the undoing for Kenya is that our politics is tribal based. That is the undoing of Kenyan politics. Our politics is tribal based. We vote along tribal lines. It doesn't matter how good a candidate is. Look at the likes of Peter Kenneth. Look at the likes of Ole Kiapi. Basically, they did not amount to much, but basically, they did not amount to much because they did not have the tribal backing. But look at Uhuru Kenyatta. He came in with the Mount Kenya voting bloc, and that is how he was able to win elections. So basically, Kenyan politics is all about the tribal numbers. What tribal numbers can you bring to the table? That is the Kenyan voting bloc. But I think we need to change that. Let's change from tribal politics to issue oriented politics, to ideology politics. That's how we'll be able to turn the leaf on this country. Otherwise, of course, Kalonzo Musyoka, they are going to be looking at who is going to bring the to end Ruto's presidency. Of course, Ruto has his Rift Valley backyard safely. Of course, they will back him almost to a man. Doesn't matter how much his record is. They will say they will stand by William Ruto. That is the only safe constituency that William Ruto has. The tribal numbers, the Rift Valley backyard will back him almost to a man. And then, of course, you have Central Kenya, 50% or maybe 40% will go for him, or maybe and then the other 60% maybe will go with Rigathi Gachagua. So basically, and I think Ruto is weighing in on whether he should forego a running mate from Mount Kenya and choose a running mate maybe from Luo Nyanza. Of course, he has been making forays into Luo Nyanza. It could be Oburu Odinga, it could be Gladys Wanga, but then of course that is not assured. The turnout in in Luo Nyanza is usually very low, and that could not that could mean that Ruto could miss out on the presidency. Of course, according to Kalonzo Musyoka, they want to make William Ruto a one-term president. That is what they want to make. They want to make William Ruto a one-term president, and so they will be doing everything possible to campaign, and in that doing, and then that is the way they will be able to afford. If they make Ruto a one-term president, then that could be afforded. There has never, Ruto insiders say, there has never been a one-term president. Ruto could be the first one-term president. It looks really imaginable that William Ruto could be the first one-term president of Kenya, and that could say a lot of things about Kenya. So basically, that is it about William Ruto becoming a one-term president, and of course, that is why calls of a one-term versus two-term. And that's the kind of politics we are going into. But of course, then it is very hard to beat an incumbent president in Africa. You must remember, in Africa, to beat an incumbent president, to beat a president that is in power, is very, very difficult. You not only have to win, but you have to bury them by millions of votes, so that even if they rig the election, then they will, even if they rig the election, the margin will be too wide to be erased by rigging of elections. But I think opposition candidates are winning in some parts of Africa. Look at Botswana in 2024, Duma Boko beating the incumbent president Maguisi Masisi. Then in Senegal, the Omai Faye beating Madoba, the ruling party candidate, and of course, that is in Zambia in 2021, the opposition candidate Hakainde Hichilema beating the incumbent president Edgar Lungu. So I think incumbent president can and do lose elections, but the margin of victory needs to be so wide so that even if the incumbent president even if the incumbent president rigs the election, they can they cannot be rigged out, and I think that's going to be what Kalonzo Musyoka must be looking at. Much of a wide, how wide of a margin should his margin of victory be? That is what Kalonzo Musyoka is going to be looking at. What it should be the margin of victory. So if Kalonzo Musyoka has a wide enough margin of victory, then he could not, then he does not need the numbers when looking at his running mate. But then, of course, if he wants a wide margin of victory, then of course he will be looking at the tribal numbers of the running mates. Of course, that is Kalonzo Sifuna, Kalonzo Matiang'i, Kalonzo Gachagua ticket. Of course, I don't know whether the impeachment of Rigathi Gachagua means he cannot stand for public office, but of course, that is something that we will have to look out for. Of course, Rigathi Gachagua has said his task will be to look for to make William Ruto a one-term president. Of course, I think it was a miscalculation on the part of President Ruto. I think he was misadvised by Kimani Ichung'wah. I think President William Ruto was misadvised by Kimani Ichung'wah. That is, Rigathi Gachagua will be no more in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, people will have forgotten him. But that's not what happened. Instead, the victim mentality is going to propel Rigathi Gachagua to a near unanimous victory. Of course, the victim mentality that here you look at this man Ruto, we gave him the words, but he persecuted our son. That is going to be the rallying call for Rigathi Gachagua. That is, we gave Ruto the votes, but then he persecuted our man. That is going to be the rallying call for the Ruto camp. And I think if that happens, then that will mean that Ruto has to do more in order to emerge victorious. But of course, maybe for William Ruto, people don't vote on development records. So even if he says he has built roads, he has built whatever he has built, but of course, people vote based on their lived experiences. That's according to the star columnist Wycliffe Muga. He says people live by their lived experience. That's according to uh, Wycliffe Muga. Development record does not sell in Kenya. That's what you must know. A development record just does not sell in Kenya. You must be able to show people emotionally connect to the people. That is what sells. I think Rigathi Gachagua advised Morara Kebaso, that is an official government spokesperson, that is Kenya's vote against, not for. Kenya's vote against, not for. So basically, if you are going to say you build roads this by kilometer, maybe 20,000 kilometer of roads, basically Kenyans don't relate to such messages. They relate to we were punished by our people. It is Rigathi Gachagua that is going to carry the day in that. And I think that is something that William Ruto must know. Of course, he says Kenyans will have a marking scheme, then they will present their report cards to Kenyans. But of course, the Kenyan voter does not vote based on a development record. Otherwise, we will be having Mwai Kibaki not having such a hard election time, maybe until he had to reach the 2007 election. Kibaki had performed well by all metrics in 2007. Kibaki had performed well in all metrics in 2007, but he was almost handed out. Were it not for the vote machinations that went on, Kibaki would have been a one-term president in 2007. So Kenyans don't vote on development record, and maybe that is what William Ruto must know. So basically, right now, the message is going to be that we gave William Ruto the votes. The Kikuyu gave William Ruto the votes, but then he did not honor their son. He hounded out their son. That is Rigathi Gachagua. That's going to be the message that is going to carry the day when they finally go to the ballot, when Kenyans finally go to the ballot in 2027. So I think it will be a very close election. if you ask me. So, of course, the united opposition, Ruto's, according to the Tifo poll, Ruto has 24% of the vote, and the united opposition has 76% of the vote. Of course, things are going to change. There are going to be a lot of dynamics. Of course, we still don't know who the candidate for the united opposition will be, Kalonzo Musyoka as it may be. We don't know whether they will stay put together, but when they will be in that negotiating room, they will be asked to come up with one candidate. They will be asked to come up with one candidate. That is the united opposition. So there will be twists and turns, but they will be asked to come up with one candidate. That is the united opposition, and that is how then they will be able to afford, that is to come up with one candidate to beat William Ruto. So basically, I think for Ruto, he says he has come to accept his fact that Kenyans will never judge a sitting president well. That is what William Ruto says. That is, Kenyans will never judge a sitting president well. Look at Moi Kibaki. We did not have very kind words for Moi Kibaki when he was in power. We did not have very kind words for Moi Kibaki when he was in power. But then when he got out, we often say Kibaki was the best Kenyan president. That is Moi Kibaki. But when he was in power, you can imagine he was almost going to lose the 2007 election, despite the economy growing by double digits year on year in between 2003 and 2007. So you can't be sure that Kenyans Kenyans only judge a president after he has been in power. Maybe that is the thinking within William Ruto's camp. That is, the president will not get his flowers now, but you can't be sure when he is out of power, then the people will clap for him. The people will say he was a good leader. But then, of course, what that means is that we must be able to. What that means is that we must be able to vote on issues. We must be able to vote on ideology. That is how Kenyans can judge the next president, and that is how then we can emerge as a country that really places a lot of weight on good leadership. Kenya is only failed by good leadership. We all have been Singapore. We all have been South Korea. Were it not for a good leadership, we will have been Singapore. We will have been South Korea. But then, of course, we don't have good leaders, and that is why and then we don't grow by double digits year on year. And I think that is something that we need to think through. We need to be able to have leaders that can take this country places. We need leaders that can take this country places. And the voter needs to change the voting dynamics from tribe to development agenda. That is what the voter needs to do. The voter needs to change his metrics from tribe to issues based politics. Let's have just two parties in Kenya, a left of center party that's about equality of opportunity, about availing free public goods, about getting everyone to the same starting lineup, and a right of center party that's about maybe individual dynamism, pulling yourself by your own bootstraps, that is standing in for the business community. We need to share this cake equitably. That's what a social democrat believes in. They believe in free primary, free education up to university. Of course, Baboino says it is very much possible in Kenya to provide free education up to university, and then of course provide free education, free healthcare, and of course SHA is trying to do that. But then, of course, there are teething problems within SHA. They say, according to Rigathi Gachagua, within the next 6 months, SHA will be overburdened and it will be no more. So basically, that's what a left of center politician does. That's what a social democrat does. In the UK, you have the Labour Party being a social democrat party, and of course, the Conservatives being a right of center party. In the US, you have a left of center party that is in the US, you have a left of center party that is the Democrats. and then you have a right of center party. That's the Republicans. That's what you have in the U.S. But in Kenya, we don't have political parties that are anchored on ideology or in their manifestos. But basically, you had Ruto promise. You had President William Ruto promise a bottoms-up economic model. That is what President William Ruto promised. He promised a bottoms-up economic model that is lifting the mama mboga, lifting the border guy, but that did not happen. Of course, you had the border guy is being felt. He's feeling the price of fuel. The mama mboga is feeling the price of fuel. Why can't President William Ruto just honor these two cadres, the Mama Mboga and the border? That is what he campaigned on, but he is not honoring that campaign promise. President William Ruto is not honoring that campaign promise, and I believe that if we had a politics that centered on ideology, then he could have lifted up the Mama Mboga, he could have lifted up the border guy, and that is how the country then could be lifted from poverty. And I think when President Ruto does not lift up the border guy, then he could be in for a ride. And this is why I guess what we need to do, then I guess what we need to be doing is to enable Kenyans to be on a trajectory to electing leaders based on ideology. Look at the way President Ruto really did in the Mama Mboga guy, or maybe the border guy. And I think if Kenyans don't come to the aid of the Mama Mboga or the border guy, and then President William Ruto will have himself to blame. That was the cornerstone of the manifesto of UDA, basically lifting up the Mama Mboga, lifting up the border guy, but that did not happen. So basically, that shows you that the president in office, the campaign candidate is not usually the president in office. It happens the world over. Kenya is no exception. That is, the campaign candidate is not the candidate in office. And so for President William Ruto, he must fulfill his doctrine to the Mamamboga, to the border guy. And I think if he fulfills that promise, then that is how Kenya could be on a trajectory to be a developed country. And I think if we become a developed country, yeah, then that is how we could, of course, Kenyans always, there is always that dilemma. Should Kenyans more celebrate that we are not Somalia or Sudan or South Sudan, or should we mourn that we are not South Korea or Singapore for that matter? Of course, the truth is somewhere in between. So we are somewhere in between South Korea and Singapore, being below them and being above Somalia or South Sudan. But I think we need to mourn that we are not South Korea or Singapore, because these countries were at the same level of development as Kenya during the 1960s. In fact, the truth is that they came to borrow a development manifesto, that is South Korea and Singapore. They came to borrow development manifestos, that is South Korea and Singapore. But then right now they are worlds apart. It is Tom Mboya that was developing that manifesto. Of course, some say sessional paper number 10 of 1965. That was the development mantra of the 1960s. South Korea and Singapore came to borrow that manifesto from Kenya, but then they went ahead, implemented that manifesto, but then, of course, Kenya did not do it. Gathered dust on the president's cabinet and the president's desk, and gathered dust because we don't do anything. We are simply good at plans. We are simply good at manifestos. But when it comes to following through, we don't we don't do due diligence. When it comes to following through the manifesto, we don't do due diligence. We don't follow through, and that is why we are good at talk. We are very good at plans. We are very good at conferences. We are very good at grand plans. But when it comes to implementing, we just don't follow it through, and that is why then we become very much we become That is why then we become very much a country that punches below its weight. So I think we need to be able to implement, and I think that's what Kalonzo Musyoka, if he becomes president, he will know he has weighty issues on his hand. How does he implement a healthcare system that is free and free? How does he implement an education system? How does he conduct a free public education from kindergarten all the way through PhD in university? That is what Kalonzo Musyoka has to ask himself. How does he implement a free healthcare, even for chronic diseases such as cancer, such as maybe diabetes, such as hypertension? How does he do that? And that is why I think Kalonzo Musyoka then has to ask himself these questions. That is how then he could be a formidable candidate. Otherwise, we will just be talking. Our politicians could just be talking, but then they do nothing to advance the agenda of the Kenyan person, and that is why I think that needs to change. We need to be able to uh, have Kenyans that are truly. And I think for the Kenyan voter, please, I persuade you, the Kenyan voter, please vote for politics of issues. Don't vote for politics of hearsay. Don't vote for politics of he said, she said, for vote for politics of ideology, vote for politics of issues. That is how we will be able to generate good leaders that are going to fight for this country, leaders that are going to really take this country, turn this country around, turn a new leaf into this country. And I think that is why I beseech the Kenyan voter, please elect leaders that are going to be the ones that can turn around this country. Vote based on ideas, vote based on issues, don't vote based on tribe. And I think if Kalonzo Musyoka then emerges as that candidate, that will be the united opposition candidate. That is how then we are going to have a Kenya that is punching above its weight. And I think, of course, for President William Ruto, he will want the opposition to be disunited. But I think when they go into that room, the opposition should just know that we are here. We want the opposition to be united. We want a single candidate, and of course, that will call out for deals and counter deals. But of course, that will call for a lot of reasoning, a lot of sober minds will need to be in that room of the united opposition so that then they can emerge with one candidate. That is what is going to ensure that the opposition sings with one voice, the opposition tags along with one voice, and that is how we can turn around this country. That is how we can turn around Kenya, and that is the way to be able to develop this country. That is the way to be able to turn the leaf on this country. So basically, do you think the opposition can be united? Do you think the opposition can be united? I just think we need to be able to do more so that the opposition can sing with the same voice, can tune in with the same voice. Otherwise, bye for now till the next time. Bye for now.